Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 3, Lecture 1, where we're doing our general introduction to metaphysics. So apologies again on how long it took to get all this stuff up. I had some personal and family issues on my end, but the important thing is that delays are done, we're getting back on track, and we're going to do that by focusing on a couple of readings today. Specifically, Where Am I by Daniel Dennett and the introduction from the textbook. Both of these are going to give us sort of our general overview and transition to a new section of philosophy, a new branch of philosophy, and a new set of questions. So today we're going to briefly go over just an overview of what metaphysics is and what sort of things it studies. We're going to focus somewhat on the specific question we'll be addressing, that is, what sort of a thing am I? And then we're going to look at an overview of possible positions, that is, answers to our question and how they line up with future readings. Now, like with the ethics unit, I want to start off with a little bit of a story, an illustration of a very dumb question about obvious stuff that's actually really worth asking. So, let's consider the ancient Greek hero Theseus. And Theseus, being an adventurous hero, like most heroes of myth and legend are, at one point decides to go on a sea adventure. We'll cut out all the context and that sort of thing, largely because I can't remember it. But suppose that Theseus is heading out on an adventurous sea voyage with all of his friends and partners, his crew, and he's going to be leaving from one place and taking a very long trip to somewhere else. Now suppose that on this very long trip, over the course of, say, a year or so, the time frame really doesn't matter. But suppose after a certain amount of time on this long adventure, Theseus notices that he's got a leaking plank. There's one it's really no good on a boat anymore. So he takes off the plank, takes it out of the deck, throws it overboard, and has the ship's carpenter fix a new plank in its place. So basically he just patches a leak. He takes one piece off the boat, throws it overboard, and patches it with a new one. Now suppose over the course of his very long trip that this same thing happens over and over again. Again, the time frame really doesn't matter. This image says years, it can be days, it doesn't matter. But over time, Theseus and his carpenter and his crew end up swapping out every single piece of the boat. Now, after the first piece is swapped out, it's pretty obvious that he's still in the same boat that he left in. After all he did was change off a plank. If he'd swapped out the doorknob on the captain's quarters or swapped a piece of rope, it wouldn't have changed whether or not it was the same ship. But by the time he gets to his destination, he's traded off every single part of the ship for a new, shiny replacement. So there's a legitimate question we can ask. Is the boat that arrives at his destination, say, boat A, is that the same as the original ship of Theseus? Now, that may actually have to make you think for a second. It seems like, in some ways, yeah, maybe it should be. Maybe it is. After all, Theseus perhaps never got off the boat. He went straight from his origin to his destination. So, since he never got off the boat, how could he have gotten on a different one? So, in some ways, yeah, it's got to be the same boat. But there's also the point to mention that none of the original parts are there. There's a whole boat's worth of stuff floating around in the ocean out there. So it's a little strange to say that it's the exact same boat that he left in. So we could answer it, but we'd feel just a little uneasy about our answer, maybe. So perhaps it's a lot like the trolley problems. There seems like there is an obvious answer, but we can start to see where you might ask some questions, where somebody could debate the issue a little bit. So let's push it and get to some of the further questions. Suppose we change the scenario slightly. So Theseus goes on his grand sea adventure, his grand sailing, oceanic quest. And he leaves behind his grown son. I forget the name. But Theseus' son really wants to go with him, and Theseus won't let him. It's too dangerous, he says. But the son, being an adventuresome and, brave and stubborn kind of guy, the son of an ancient Greek hero, he puts together a raft and decides to follow after his father's boat anyway. He's just, a few hours to a day behind, whatever it took for him to lash some stuff together for a raft. So the son follows after the exact path of the boat, And after about a day or so, or a year, or whatever time period we're looking at, he notices a plank floating by in the water. And so the son picks up the plank and, say, adds it to his raft. Hey, why let a good piece of wood go to waste? And then another stretch of time passes, and he finds another plank, another piece. All right, we'll do these, add them to the raft, and keep going. And so over time, Theseus' son ends up collecting all of these various bits of wood and rope and sail and everything else. And it turns out these are all the pieces of the original boat, the things that Theseus is throwing over the side every time he makes a replacement. And the son, being quite resourceful and inventive, builds a boat. It turns out to be an exact replica. It is literally all the original pieces that Theseus left with. So when Theseus sails into his destination in ship A, made of all shiny replacement parts, his son pulls up in ship B, which is made of all the old the original parts, all the things that Theseus left his origin with. And so now we've got a legitimate question. Which one of these two ships is the ship of Theseus? Theseus left in one boat. That is, he left in the ship of Theseus. That much is certain. But by the time he got to his destination, there are two boats. So which one's the actual ship of Theseus? Is it the one that Theseus traveled in, the one that we said just a second ago was probably the same boat? Or is it the boat made of all the original pieces, the one that his son collected and followed along behind him in? It seems like we've got a little bit of a puzzle here. There's a legitimate question. It sounds dumb to say which one's the original boat, but we've got a legitimate puzzle here. You can make a really strong argument that A is the ship and that B is the original ship. Now, the ship of Theseus is meant to be a thought experiment. It's the same sort of hypothetical scenario that tries to demonstrate a point. So in this case, it's usually used to demonstrate things on how, identity is a lot stranger than we think. It is telling that something's the same from one moment to another. And in particular, it shows that physical continuity, that is having the same physical parts over time, might not be enough for it to be, for something to be identical to a past self. And that seems like a really strange and weird puzzle for a philosophy we're focused on, but maybe it doesn't matter. But it turns out that it does. It actually directly applies to you. You see, it turns out, you may not be aware of this, but you're actually constantly losing and swapping out pieces of yourself. Every time you touch something, you're leaving behind a handful of skin cells. Every time you breathe, a few more of the particles of your body go out with your breath. Your body is constantly finding, replacing, and swapping out various physical pieces and parts. You're constantly shedding atoms and cells. And it's all of you. It's not just your skin or your mucous membranes or something like that. Even your nervous system and your skeleton get replaced over time. Your skeleton, for example, actually gets replaced about every 10 years or so at least. I've seen some estimates that say probably closer to 7. So you are literally not made of a single physical part that you were born with. There's not one atom in your body that was there at the moment you were born. Yet somehow, we still think that you're the same person as the baby that came from your mother, or whatever strange scientific scenario helps make you possible if you're a less conventional sort of fellow. So either way, we seem to think that you have some sort of identity over time, but what's the justification there? The physical parts aren't the same. But despite all the different changes you've gone through, we seem to generally say, yes, you're the same person. Now, I'm not talking about metaphorically, you're not the same person that you were a few years ago. You're the same person you were a few years ago or something like that. I mean literally. The government and all your friends, they point at a picture of baby you and a picture of adult you, and they say that both of those are you. And that seems to be true regardless of how many changes you've gone through. But why? There's a legitimate question there. One that actually should probably unsettle you just a little bit. And these kinds of questions, thankfully, are the sorts of things that people are trying to figure out somewhere. These are the sorts of things that have their own branch of philosophy devoted to them. Now, in the last unit, we looked at questions of ethics, questions about right and wrong, the good life, or more specifically for us, whether or not morality is objective, and whether or not we've got a reason to follow those kinds of objective rules. Now, this time around we're looking at metaphysics. And metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the questions about identity and a lot of other different questions. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that studies the fundamental principles of reality. So where ethics studies things about how we ought to act, should we act this way? Do we have a reason to act according to the rules of morality? What are those rules? It's all stuff about what we ought to do. And if you remember from the intro stuff, some of the other branches like epistemology, they investigate questions about belief and knowledge. Metaphysics looks at stuff. Metaphysics seeks to analyze the world, the universe around us, and the very nature of that universe. The fundamental principles and ideas that organize it and form as its building blocks. And I don't mean this in the same way as like, oh, it's a fluffy, bad version of science or something like that. Metaphysics literally means beyond physics, or after physics. It's the questions that physical tests and observations and experiments can't quite get at. And these are questions like, what sorts of things exist? What counts as real? What is time? What is identity? What distinguishes one thing from another? Does God exist? What makes similar things similar? Like, why are all white things considered white? Is there an essence that they share in common? Do we just label things that look close enough white? These are legitimate questions that deserve answers. And there's actually some very deep and disturbing puzzles about them, things like the ship of Theseus, or facts about how you're constantly changing out physical parts that warrant investigation. Perhaps some of these aren't as difficult as others. But a lot of these puzzles are things that we legitimately don't have good answers to, or at least not yet. And so thankfully there's a branch of philosophy that's focused on trying to get at these fundamental questions, these very basic questions about what the universe is like, what sorts of categories of things exist in it, and how should we sort things into those categories. This is sometimes an activity described as carving nature at the joints, alongside the sciences, because they try and do this sort of thing as well, just with regards to physical observable stuff. Now, carving in nature at the joints is a metaphor. It means trying to categorize and classify the world in accurate ways. It means that we sort the world into different categories. We say, oh, this is a matter of physics. This is a matter of chemistry. These are animals. These are birds. These are plants. So human beings, they go around and they classify things, and we organize things, and we try and label and understand the world in certain ways. And metaphysics is trying to do the same sort of thing by trying to understand what sort of things exist, how should we understand those things, how are they organized, how do they relate to each other, what is existence versus non-existence, one person versus a different person, these kinds of different questions. We're trying to sort out the world in certain ways. But with metaphysics, we're trying to not leave some of these fuzzy, fundamental questions up to chance, or up to just casual, sloppy common sense. Instead, we're trying to find where the actual divisions in nature are, like the joints, say, in an animal, and we're trying to slice up and categorize the world according to the divisions that are already there, like a butcher trying to carve up an animal according to the joints and the divisions that are already present in the animal they're working with. So that's where the metaphor comes from. I bring it up because it's often referenced in texts or in discussions, something worth knowing. So as a part of all this, as a way of trying to categorize the world according to certain ways, make sure we get it accurate, I think it's actually worth going back and saying that there's one way we could probably help with our ship of Theseus problem. What if we actually went back and clarified what we meant by the original ship, and tried to figure out what kind of a thing is the original ship? Is it just a collection of physical parts? Or is it a non-physical thing, like an arrangement or a ghost or an essence? Is there some other thing besides the physical pieces that matters? So if we clarified precisely what kind of a thing the ship is, what kind of a thing the original ship is, then we'd have a lot easier time in trying to identify whether A or B is the same as the original ship. Because then we'd know, are we just looking for the original parts, and therefore B is the correct choice? Are we looking for anything that shares, physical continuity throughout time, so we'd be closer to A? Or is there something like a non-physical essence that's in common throughout all these? Is that what we should be looking for? In which case, depending on which of the two things had such an essence, or perhaps if neither of them did, we'd still have a clearer answer. So figuring out what kind of a thing the ship is a really, really good way to start answering this question. And it's this particular question, what kind of a thing are we looking at, that I want to focus on with our unit. In particular, I want to focus this on us so we can keep it relevant. I want to focus in this unit on the question of what sort of a thing am I? Am I a physical thing? Am I a non-physical thing? Am I a combination of the two? We're not talking questions about species or biological traits or even about human nature or your psychology, your personality, none of that. We're talking at the most basic, fundamental, general categories. Are you a physical thing? Are you a non-physical thing? Are you some combination? Are you neither? That's the kind of question I mean when we talk about what sort of a thing am I. The most broad and general and fundamental categories the entire universe is divided up into. So, if we can answer that sort of thing, then we're going to be determining what general category a human being belongs in. And because we're going to be having to talk about a complete human being, not just the animal Homo sapiens sapiens, means we're going to be dabbling in philosophy of mind a little bit in addition to metaphysics. And technically, you probably could overlap the two quite a lot, with philosophy of mind being a more focused and applied version of metaphysics. But as far as we're concerned, we're mainly doing metaphysics and just dabbling a little bit in philosophy of mind as well. Now, the question of what sort of a thing am I is a rather difficult question. It's a lot like the ship of Theseus. We've got a lot of conflicting intuitions about what's going on. Because most of us tend to think, I imagine, that there are certain indicators that we've got more parts than just the physical stuff we're made of. We like to think that we have beliefs and intentions and desires, and that even with all of our physical parts swapped out, that there's still something continuing throughout time that makes us us. But we can't ever point at any of those things physically. You can't put a human being in a blender and then pull out beliefs and desires or a soul or a mind or anything like that. Those sorts of things are non-physical. Even things like current neuroscience and cognitive science can't ever point at the mind or beliefs or intentions. All they can do is say that this physical part reacts alongside whatever's going on mentally, if there is such a thing as the mental. So even detailed brain scans and neuroscience, they only look at ever physical things and physical processes. And if we at least have intuitions about being non-physical, if we're going to legitimately investigate those, then we can't entirely rely on purely physical sciences. They can give us a large amount of evidence, but they can't be the only thing we look at. So, to sort of help illustrate the kinds of puzzles and difficulties here, since I'm telling you it's a really hard problem, it's probably just easier for you to experience some of the different intuitions and the puzzles yourself. And I think a really good piece for doing this is contemporary and living philosopher Daniel Dennett's piece, Where Am I? It's a fictional story, but he's a philosopher, so it's got a lot of philosophical substance. The basic idea of the story is that Dennett, very oddly for a professional philosopher, has been called in a secret mission for the U.S. government to help retrieve a lost piece of radioactive equipment. I think it's a damaged missile or a reactor or something like that. I can't remember the exact detail. But the point is that because he's being sent on this secret mission to undergo, all these risks involving radioactivity, turns out that his brain is the only part of him that might be at risk physically from the device. So they're going to have him undergo some serious, radical, experimental brain surgery where they remove his brain while he's still alive and let him still control his body via radio waves. And the story escalates from there and gets a lot more complicated, but we'll walk through some of the details and the important part of the questions that the story raises, and the scenario raises. It helps illustrate some of the difficulties we have with identifying and saying, what exactly am I? If I end up getting split into different pieces, where is myself, my identity, where is it located? Is it with the brain, with the body, somewhere in the middle? Is it with some non-physical thing? These are the kinds of questions that the story raises. But I want you to see for yourself. So, Daniel Dennett is the wonderfully, magnificently bearded gentleman you see on the screen before you in a couple of places. And Dennett undergoes the brain surgery in the story, and then afterwards starts getting up and walking around saying, "Hey, I feel great. The surgery didn't really do anything to me." And he's wondering what went on, and so the scientists show him around the lab. And they take him to another room, and they point to his brain in a jar over on, say, the right side of the wall of the lab, and there it is hooked up to all those wires controlling him. And so there he is, staring at his own brain. And so Dennett starts to ask himself, where am I located? Am I there in that jar, or am I outside the jar staring at it? Where am I? Am I staring at myself? Am I staring at something else? How do I talk about this? How do I understand what's going on here? So to keep everything straight, Dennett assigns labels and possible answers to the various pieces and things that are going on. He decides, taking inspiration from Shakespeare for whatever reason, to name his brain Yorick and his body Hamlet, after the famous soliloquy, I think in Act 3 of Hamlet. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. To be or not to be, that whole famous little speech. If you've not read it as a part of a required English class, go read it. It's actually really good. Hamlet's kind of emo and annoying, but the soliloquies, the individual speeches, and the writing, beautiful. Anyway, so Dennett labels his body Hamlet and his brain Yorick, so that he can help keep straight what he's talking about. And he's going to refer to himself as Dennett. So now the question is, where's Dennett? Is Dennett identified with Hamlet? Is he inside Hamlet? Or is Dennett in the jar with Yorick? Because although intelligently he wants to say, I'm with my brain, because that's where all the thinking's going on, it feels like he's inside Hamlet. Because that's where his vision's going on, it's where it seems like he's located. So he's really not sure which one of those things he is. And it's also possible, Dennett realizes, that he could technically be somewhere in the middle. There could be an immaterial soul or a mind or something like that, that's sort of floating in between the two, or riding along with the radio waves or something. But Dennett has opinions about this, like anybody, especially because he's a philosopher. So he just flat out says, I know, being a materialist, and we'll get to what that means here in a minute, that I'm not the soul. So I'm either going to be Hamlet or I'm going to be in Yorick. One of those two is where I'm located. But I don't know which. Part of me says, the intelligent thinking part of me, says that I can't be Hamlet. Because, if Hamlet dies, presumably I'll just still be sitting around thinking in my jar. I also know that, the thinking part of me is really what's important about me. So I'm probably not located in Hamlet. I'm not located in the body. But at the same time, I can't really and honestly, Dennett says, say that I'm located in that jar over there either, because it's not what it feels like. No matter how hard I imagine it, no matter how hard I think that I'm in a jar and this strange bearded man is staring at me, I can't make that work in my head. It just feels too strongly, too correctly, that I'm not in that jar. So I don't think, at least for now, that I'm in the jar as Yorick either. So Dennett, tentatively and temporarily, ends up deciding, well, I'm wherever I think I am. That'll just have to do for now. I'll spend some more time on this later. And so Dennett goes off and does the mission with this temporary little truce located in his mind for now, that he is wherever he thinks he is. Now let's not worry too much about his response, but I want you to pause for just a second and think about the puzzle here, the different intuitions here. Dennett's highlighting what I think are some very common sense thoughts if you were thrust into this very strange sci-fi type of scenario. It seems that we're located somewhere in the body, but at the same time we know a lot of things about ourselves that say that no, we're the brain, and maybe if Dennett didn't rule out the possibility of a soul, that might even be a better response, because he doesn't seem to be really lining up with either of his physical parts. Maybe there's a non-physical part that's actually him. So these are some of the possibilities to start thinking about. Now in the story, Dennett goes off on his secret mission. He's somewhere, And his brain's located in Houston, and his body goes off to Oklahoma, where the secret mission goes and takes place. And so Dennett drives the body Hamlet, his original body, down underground and towards the missile, but lo and behold, something goes wrong. The transmitters stop working, radioactivity does something weird, it's never really quite explained, but something horrible goes wrong. And Hamlet becomes irrevocably lost. Dennett's lost his original body, everything goes dark for a while. He's still alive, he's still thinking, but he's got no vision, no sight, no sounds, no touch, and all he's doing is thinking, and eventually somebody drugs him and he goes off to sleep. Now when Dennett wakes up, the story starts getting a lot more complicated, and this is why especially the diagrams are nice. See, Dennett wakes up, and it turns out that the scientists have given him a new body. And just for the sake of clarity, Dennett decides to name the new body Fortinbras, after another Shakespearean character from Hamlet. Now, so Dennett's driving around Fortinbras, controlling it, and so he explores the lab a little bit, and he finds out that the scientists have made another change, just in case. See, it turns out that in addition to Yorick, the scientists have actually made a computer brain that is an exact duplicate of Dennett. It has his every thought. It's like they scanned his brain for every detail and then built a digital computer version of his brain. So now in addition to his brain doing all the thinking, there's also this computer brain that for whatever reason the scientists have named Hubert. And it turns out that both Hubert and Yorick are thinking the exact same thing at the exact same time, because they built them that way. Or they built Hubert that way. It's an exact copy, and so long as it's receiving the exact same stimuli, the same information that Yorick is, Hubert will continue to think and choose and do all the exact same things as Yorick. And just to make things even worse, complication-wise, it turns out that they've given Dennett a switch, to where if he flips the switch, he can actually switch between Yorick and Hubert, and as to which one's controlling Fortinbras. And Dennett can't tell the difference. He flips the switch and it goes from Yorick to Hubert, and he doesn't feel a thing. He doesn't notice anything if he's in the middle of a sentence. No hesitation happens. Things go on as if nothing changed at all. And so Dennett starts getting really confused as to where he's actually located. Now, for the end of the story, I'll leave that as a spoiler-free mystery for you. You're going to have to go read it to go get this stuff yourself. But our point of all this is to show that there are some real puzzles going on about what makes up a human being. Are we just physical things? Are we just brains? Or are we something else? Are we something immaterial, something that can't be located on a diagram of brains and computers and bodies and switches? Where are we? What are we? What kind of a thing is a human being? And it's actually kind of hard to answer that. Our intuitions and the things that we know about ourselves, they don't line up very well, but we don't really want to say that either one's directly false. Personal experience seems to tell us that we're located in our bodies, and that's not something that we want to just say we're utterly mistaken about. Since we're always experiencing things from that location, and it treats us well, and it just seems so true. And considering how we're in, very difficult to prove territory, really strongly seeming true is actually something we probably want to hold on to, at least for a while. And for the record, as far as future discussions go, by body I'll include the brain as well. Dennett split them up for his story. We'll be talking about body and brain together. Physical stuff. But in addition to saying that we're located in our bodies, we also like to say that we're more than just physical stuff. We like to think that we have thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, emotions, and all these other things that just aren't made of matter. Again, if you stuck a human being in a blender and then ran all the stuff through a centrifuge or through a sieve, a filter, you wouldn't find any particles of love or, here's a belief that got strained out. Those sorts of things aren't physical things. They're non-physical. They're mental. And no matter how hard we look with a scalpel, a knife, or a microscope, we'll never find those kinds of things. But we seem to very much think that they're part of who we are. We seem to think that we've got non-physical parts as well as physical parts. At least we have intuitions that way. And so since we don't want to give up those intuitions either, they seem just as true as the things about the body, it seems we've got some stuff to work out. But thankfully, all this stuff kind of points at and hints at the possible kinds of answer to our question, to possible kinds of answer to the notion of what are we. And so we can outline these three kinds of answers under the names materialism, idealism, and dualism. Now, each of these positions, each of these theories, is an attempt at an explanation. They're trying to explain what a human being is. Now, materialism tries to explain a human being purely in terms of physical stuff. So in our helpful little diagram, a materialist explanation of what Dennett is to say that Dennett's the same as Hamlet. He's the physical body, including Yorick and the brain and all that. So materialism is the view that human beings are purely physical beings. Now, idealism is the name for the kind of position that we're purely non-material, that we're nothing but minds or souls, and that actually, there's some more complicated thing going on with regards to what we are and how we interact with the world. And we'll get to that sort of in a minute. And that's our sort of middle picture. And dualism is the theory that tries to explain human beings using both material and non-material parts and explanations. Now, as far as which view is more common, dualism is probably the most popular view among the kinds of positions that people take. And we're going to be looking at all these positions with sort of an exception of idealism. See, idealism is far less commonly held than the other couple of positions. It's very rare that somebody ends up arguing that we don't have physical parts to us. That just seems a little too obvious to most of us, that we do, have physical, meaty parts. Usually, in order to make an idealist picture work, and there are people that do, we have to do a lot more complicated stuff, and we just simply don't have time to go into that. In perhaps another class, a different class, if you continue pursuing philosophy, you'll read things like Bishop Berkeley's view that we're all nothing but minds in the imagination of God or something like that. But you end up getting a lot more complicated pictures that we just simply won't spend the time on. So primarily, we're going to be spending time on the other two, dualism and materialism, these attempts at explanation of what a human being is. Now, as far as readings go, Descartes' going to be the biggest voice for dualism. He's the classic historical voice who gives us the version of dualism that most people have in mind when they talk about it. And Churchland and Ryle are going to give us much stronger critiques of what dualism is. They're going to say that dualism is mistaken, and instead they're going to end up defending some version of materialism. Ryle technically doesn't do it much in our own reading. He just shoots dualism down. But implicitly, as far as we're concerned, that means that he endorses some version of materialism instead. So, as for how they end up doing all this, we'll have to save that for another time. So, good luck. If you have any questions about this sort of stuff, again, always feel free to ask me questions, send me emails. I am here to help you as much as possible, I promise. I'm meant to be a resource for you guys. So if anything ends up being strange or confusing, ask, and I promise I will help. That said, I'll see you next time. Happy reading!